think it went down something like this. I'm almost certain that Fauci and company knew about the lab leak all the way from at least October 2019 for the military games in Wuhan. They knew about it, and but it takes us all the way to the end of January before Jeremy Farrar and Fauci are on the on the phones, buying burner phones and holding secret meetings and trying to figure out what's going on what. But the very first impulse was to deny that it was a lab leak. Okay, um, and they knew that that was wrong, but they called out this paper called "Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2," and later paid off all the people who signed. Yeah, and paid off everybody with grants from NIH, whatever. And the authors themselves, we have emails now where they were skeptical about making these claims that they thought were very likely false. Um, so that seemed to be the very first impulse. But they decided to deny it first. Now, how does that fit in with, let's say, an ambition to vaccinate the world's populations with these new products? And that comes about because Fauci is very proud to have worked on mRNA technology for the 25 years prior, which becomes a sort of subscription technology where you just kind of laser print your potion depending on the genetic sequencing of the virus, and it allows you to respond very, very quickly to any new pathogen, real or artificial. So they wanted to get the shot out, and you have to think about alternative situations. If people believed it was a lab leak and that this was a Frankenstein monster virus, they probably would have been more willing to get the shot. But the problem was that the lab was definitely funded by U.S. taxpayers, and they did not. And I presume that they thought it was more deadly than it really was. And don't forget that the initial iteration was very severe, right? I mean, but the people who caught it back in October, God, their tales of woe, really something. What's called the wild type was actually quite severe, much more severe than, say, Omicron became later. But so they didn't want to be blamed for having started a global pandemic and then World War III with China, right? So there's very dicey relationship at that point between the U.S. and Xi Jinping. So they wanted to kind of get that off the table. Now they had another problem though. They still had to they wanted to use this virus to, and these might have been separate things. I'm not entirely sure, but as a way of kind of deploying under emergency use authorization mRNA technology, which previously had never gotten through any of the trials. It had never been authorized before by the FDA, but it could be under emergency use authorization in the midst of a kind of a panic. So as part of that, they had to rely on a kind of a new theory that had been batting around for a while. What's Fauci's co-author named David
Morans.
David Morans.
Yeah.
Had been taken the lead on this idea, and he had been promoting this. And in fact, in an August paper in Cell, that came out in 2020, which is kind of their ex post rationale for this whole thing. They have this theory that crossover viruses are becoming an existential threat to humanity. So my puppy gets a disease and coughs on me or whatever, it licks me in the morning, licks my face, and suddenly I've got some terrible disease he picked up from eating a squirrel the previous day, and then I spread it out. So it leaps from humans to from animals to humans. So here's what's interesting about that theory. Well, if that's true, and it probably is true to some extent, um, why would it be a unique problem of our time as versus say 500,000 years ago or a
hmm
million years ago, right?
When we were, frankly, a lot closer to animals.
Right. And their idea is that this was this problem, this unique problem of our times, a growing problem that we can only use extreme fast printing
Right.
mRNA technology to do, is a consequence of urbanization, industrialization,
Which have to
and
be gotten rid of.
yeah, and living too closely together, moving too
Yeah.
fast. Uh, uh, I don't
Yeah.
know,
Kind of
listening to
the
rap music.
WEF formulations, the Klaus Schwabian view.
Yeah, yeah, we've gotten out of hand. We just drive
Yeah.
around all the time and eat shit and just live on top of each other and use air conditioning all the time. Just like everything in the whole modern world is leading to this one terrible thing of growing spillover viruses. So that was their thinking. We will. And by the way, I'm not just making all this stuff. Like I have a strong basis for everything I'm saying. You know that, right? But so there were several parts. One is deny the lab leak to avoid culpability. The second one is to advance this spillover thing and link up with the World Economic Forum, and that fits in with climate change, ideology too, and advertise this is spillover problem as unique to the modern age that can only be addressed by mRNA, fast moving mRNA technology, vaccine passports, and widespread testing and health records. So I believe this whole scheme was well mapped out in late January. Now there are certain problems with my scenario. One is that I'm going to say on something like February 24th, 2020, uh, Fauci did an interview with the Washington Post, and they asked him if we needed a vaccine to get out of this, to get away from COVID. And his answer was no. We can control the spread of this virus through social distancing alone. I believe that he was saying that to buy them time. Uh, there was plenty of time to announce first the lockdowns as a way to control the virus, and then say, several weeks later, which indeed they did, a vaccine is on the way. So I think that was all propaganda designed to achieve the goal. And I should say that in April of 2020, I was sitting there, I was raging against lockdowns. This is stupidest crap in the world, blah blah blah. And I got a call from a guy named Rajiv Venkaya, who was working for a vaccine company, but he had been George W. Bush's lead on bioterrorism in the White House back in 2004 and 2005, and had long taken credit for having invented pandemic planning and response. And in many ways, the godfather of lockdowns. And he called me up on the phone and he said, "You really need to stop all this raging against lockdowns. It's very bad." And I said, "Well, okay, but I just don't understand what's going on here. And I understand who you are. I understand what you believe, but I've had a question for you. Um, Ever since I've been following your work, which is, what do you think? Like, let's say we all just live in refrigerator boxes for a month, um, and somehow this magically drives the R naught down below one, so that the virus, um, is not a problem so long as we're in our refrigerator box. Where where does the virus go? Where does the pathogen go? I mean, it's not like it jumps on a spaceship and goes to space, or falls into a squirrel hole and never. This 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 member of the microbial kingdom newly exists and will always exist, as far as I know. So why do you think that the human population would not continue to be vulnerable to it once we stop being locked down? And there's this long pause on the phone. He says, I could tell you, and I'll just between us, we're going to have a vaccine. And that's the first I had heard of it. And I said, you are not serious, are you? And he said, I'm very serious. I said, first of all, you can't vaccinate against a widespread respiratory virus.
Yeah, no, it's the wrong modality. I mean,
Yeah.
injection.
So there was that, and then I said, and plus, a vaccine that's known to be safe and effective will take 15 years. And he said, you are going to be very shocked at how quickly we get this thing out. And I said, well, Rajiv, good talking to you, but I hung up the phone because I thought he was a crazy person. I thought this has been, had been put on a shelf somewhere, and didn't know what he was talking about because I thought it was the most insane scheme I'd ever heard in my life. It turned out he was exactly right. We were going to stay locked down until the vaccine came out.
If you like this video, check out the full interview. Also, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you get notified every time a new video is uploaded. Thanks for watching.